An, under, an underrated, and oh my god, underrated. Why is it so hard to say? An underrated aspect of animation that I often don't actually see a lot of people mentioning is lip syncing. If you don't know, lip syncing is basically a technique where you have your mouth match up with the audio in the timeline. For example, singers actually do this technique when they are making their music videos. So it might look like that they are singing in the music videos, but in actuality, they are just matching up their mouth along with the audio. So then it can have the illusion that they are singing in real time in the videos. And that's the same thing with animation. Lip syncing is a technique that can help sell the illusion of cartoon characters. Turning a cartoon character from a couple of lines or polygons into a living, breathing character with personalities and mannerisms. And the interesting thing about lip syncing in animation is how it's changed and evolved over time. Because if we go way back in the early years of the history of animation, which would be around the 1910s to the 1920s, we would find that there wasn't any lip syncing back then. Actually, there wasn't even sound in films back then. Because in the early years of film, it was known as back in the early days, there were no talking and or speaking characters whatsoever on the big screen in animated pictures. In fact, sometimes they would just write the dialogue on the screen next to the characters, like little speech bubbles mimicking newspaper comics. But then one day, the entire animation and film industry was changed forever after the release of this landmark animated picture. The very first animated picture that incorporated sound within the film itself was none other than... Whoa! Now just wait a gosh darn minute. A popular misconception is that Steamboat Willie from 1928 is the very first ever animated picture that had sound in it. So, Walt Disney gets a lot of credit for that landmark achievement. In actuality, the very first animated picture that had the very first instant of a speaking cartoon character with lip syncing was called My Old Kentucky Home from 1926. And it was made by Max Fleischer and his brothers of Fleischer Studios, who pioneered this film and the technology behind it. And here it is.
Hold the bell and join in, everybody.
Yep. that was it. That was the very first instance of lip syncing ever. Now, admittedly, it is a bit primitive, but of course it does. This is the very first time an animated character ever spoke on screen, so it's bound to be primitive. So, nonetheless, this is a remarkable achievement on the history of film itself. However, in an ironic way, despite seeing it as an incredible achievement nowadays, Fleischer's short film came at a time where the idea of talking pictures, albeit a novelty, was considered to be a little bit more than a short-term fad. Gee, talking movies? Totally a fad from 100 years ago. But it wasn't until Steamboat Willie was released where the concept of sound effects in film really took off in a major way in pop culture. That is the reason why Walt Disney gets so much credit for having sound in animated films. Old Papa Disney might have not been the first to have synchronized sound in animation, but he sure was the first to popularize it. Now, if we move forward in the timeline, by the time of the 30s and 40s, the concept of sound and talking pictures would be completely normalized. And the lip syncing technique would have been And at this point, lip syncing would have had a vast improvement since its early days. Disney would have made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1939. Sorry, 1937, which was the Disney's company, no, which was the Disney company's first which was the Disney company's first ever feature-length film. And for the film, they not only had sound effects and talking characters in it with smooth lip syncing, but on top of that, they had musical numbers with characters singing, which the animators would have to carefully match the lip syncing with the audio. And then by the 1940s, Warner Brothers would have released A Wild Hare, which was the first time Bugs Bunny, along with his iconic Brooklyn accent, showed up in his own short film. And you can see how they have nailed down the lip syncing technique into a science, and just how smooth it has become. But there was a catch with lip syncing. At this point in time of the 1940s, they would have to draw every single frame of animation of the entire character to achieve the fluidity, hold on. Fluidity. To achieve the fluidity in the cartoons. And that kind of stuff can become very, very expensive real quick. And that's where the next technique of lip syncing comes around. In 1957, the Hanna-Barbera studio was born, and their goal was to create animated episodes for television. However, when it came to creating animated television, they had a very limited budget back then, so they couldn't just redraw every single new frame. Otherwise, it would cost way too much. That's why they heavily relied on limited animation. Using a small set of reusable mouth shapes they can just swap in and change. Almost like puppets, really.
No, I don't mean that kind of puppets.
And if they didn't cut as many corners as they did, it would have been impossible for them to make as many shows and episodes as they did. Speaking of which, I wonder how many shows and episodes they did make overall. Wait, let me just take a little look and... Oh my god! Dang, that is a lot. So, anyway, after Hanna-Barbera's cost-cutting technique that they pioneered in the 60s, there weren't many changes or advances with the way lip-syncing was done in animation for a while. Until we reach all the way to the 1990s, where a major advancement was introduced in animation. And that advancement was...
3D animation!
Now, 3D computer graphics have actually been around even way before it was the 90s. But it was only in the 90s where very major breakthroughs of CGI and 3D animations were really being made consistently. And that includes lip syncing as well. Of course, just like most things related to 3D animation, the famous and acclaimed animation studio Pixar were the ones pioneering major breakthroughs in this field. They especially made major breakthroughs when they made the first Toy Story movie, which, if you think about it, must have been an almost impossible task to achieve for the time. You gotta remember, the technology they had back in the 90s is not at all like the tech we have nowadays in the 2020s. They had to make the first fully 3D computer-generated animated film. Once again, the very first ever. And honestly, for the most part, it kinda holds up. Now, of course, lip syncing has had major improvements in 3D animation over time, but for 1995, it's pretty dang good. And here is Pete Docter, who worked on the first Toy Story movie at the time, explaining real quick on how they kind of did lip syncing in this film.
And you know, there's a lot of funniness and buttons all over the place, but it's actually fairly simple. So first we have the dialogue, and I look at the dialogue to see where the sound falls and how I can fit the visuals to the dialogue. We start with, this is the soundtrack, and that's all we have to go with. So we have...
Nothing. I'm sure Andy was just a little excited, that's all.
And we try to find out on what frame does each sound fall on so we can fit the visuals to the sound. There's actually another camera that looks directly at his face, so that when I'm done with his body, this camera will stay locked to his nose. So no matter where he turns, up, down, sideways, the camera stays right here, and then I can work just on the facial animation. So now if I want him to smile, I can just grab one of his smile controls, turn that up. Ta-da! Let me have him smile on the other side as well.
Whoa, that's pretty cool. And now, if we go all the way back in the current timeline that we are in, the major difference in how lip syncing works in 3D animation is that nowadays there are bone rigs you can move around on screen with your mouse instead of changing individual numbers of each part of the body like we watched in the video. So it is definitely makes it a heck of a lot easier. And now, finally, there is one more lip syncing technique I want to mention. And it's actually the technique that I use in this very video itself that you're watching right now. Oh my god! It's basically like the Hanna-Barbera's technique where I have a file full of different kinds of mouth shapes, and I just sort of, go through them and reuse the mouth shape to try to match frame by frame that I'm saying in my audio in the timeline. This is what a lot of animators and 2D animated shows nowadays do, because it makes the process of lip syncing a lot easier and less tedious than if you redraw the mouth every single time for the character. Although, it definitely doesn't mean it makes lip syncing completely easy. Lip syncing is very much still a very tedious and slow process that takes a lot of time to get right, because if you mess it up, it can be very noticeable. I'm not going to lie, lip syncing is probably one of my least favorite part of the animation process. I mean, don't get me wrong, after I finish it, it is very satisfying to look back and see the end result. The problem is that since in those videos that I make, I talk a lot, it can take a while to finish, and it can make me very impatient and annoyed. But, oh well, I guess that's just how lip syncing works. But at the same time, that also goes to show how much lip syncing adds into animated characters. It adds so much charm, personality, and life to characters that, despite how annoying it can be to deal with, sometimes it can be worth it.